Good day, listeners. My name is Ryan Todd, and I am your host for Beyond the Checkbox. Today we have a very special guest, Gethin Nadin, who is a psychology graduate, and he has been working in employee benefits, employee experience for over 20 years, and had a book that came out in 2018, 2019 called A World of Good, where he traveled the world, got stories from around the world about the best and most prominent workplaces and how they treat their employees. And his thesis is that we are ripe for change right now. We are at a time when we've had workplace practices that are over 100 years old. Now, of course, this hypothesis came out before COVID, before the pandemic changed our entire workforce permanently, forever, in really dramatic ways. So today you will have an experience of listening to Gethin talk about what we're doing in the workplace now that will change, that has to change, that should change, and his perspectives on really the macro context around the employee experience, the consumer experience. And I'm really excited about this conversation. I hope you are too. This is Beyond the Checkbox, where you learn how to integrate more mental wellness into your organization through frontline leaders. And I am your host, Ryan Todd. A couple of things that that I've been thinking about in the meantime which might be kind of more interesting and a good kind of jump off point is for the book, did you, like, you traveled around the world, did you do it all in one fall swoop, or were you kind of going and coming back home, coming back home, doing a little bit of research, coming back? Like, what was that experience like for you?
So it was going to some different countries that kind of helped to grow the idea of the book. I was going to write a book on kind of the employee experience anyway, it started with a trip to Copenhagen, where I started understanding this concept of fika, which is this idea of going for coffee and a pastry, and how that's become a bit of an institution in the workplace to take a break from work. And so I kind of started to realize that actually that's a really traditional thing that this country's been doing for a long time. Yet this idea of breaking from work and not talking about work and connecting with other people at work that you wouldn't usually was quite an interesting part of kind of feeling like you're part of a community, which we know makes a great employee experience. And so that was really the catalyst. So I looked back to the countries I'd visited. There are some countries in the book I haven't visited, but I had some good stories to tell. But it was really that one trip that kind of became the catalyst for, I wonder what other cultures do that we could learn from.
How did you discover that process? Like that wasn't being done in England or other kind of countries. How did you discover it, and when did you think, oh, that's different, and that's like a really interesting and possibly positive thing for the workplace?
So it was actually, so in Copenhagen, there's a lot of coffee shops, and obviously we have Danish pastries, which kind of across the world, I'm assuming they're just pastries in Denmark. This idea of kind of, I remember heard the word fika in a coffee shop, and they had it written on the wall, and I asked the woman in the coffee shop about it, and she said, oh, it means to kind of have a break. And I came back and I mentioned it to somebody who I was doing some work with at the time, and they said, oh, there's a really popular YouTube song about fika. These two young guys have created this kind of rap in Denmark about fika, and I listened to that, and it had millions of views. And then just kind of looked into it, and fika was just one of the many words that there's no real translation for in the English language. And so some other common ones are things like hygge, which is Hygge, which is a feeling of kind of warmth and relaxation. So it has no direct translation. And I was really interested in that concept. And then I started to realize that it was actually being used in the workplace as this idea of, let's get people together, not talk about work. It doesn't matter what level that you are at in the organization, but just building those kind of connections at work, getting to understand colleagues as people rather than just colleagues, was a really interesting concept. And so I used that concept as a kind of jumping off point to talk about, actually, should we be formalizing breaks a bit more at work? Should we be encouraging people to take time out? Should we be giving them permission to take time out their day to spend with each other? And using all the evidence to kind of back up that point. And, we have great evidence from people like Google's Aristotle project, where they looked at what creates a high performing team. And they found out that the key indicator of a high performing team was psychological safety. And I don't think you can have high psychological safety in a team environment if people don't understand each other's kind of lives and motivations. And FICA and breaks from work and that kind of social aspect of work, I think, is a really important part of that team's success.
Did you see it as much different than a coffee break? Like I remember I worked at a tire shop growing up for like a summer job. It was a really great place to work, and we would break like religiously at like 10:15, and I think it was like 3 o'clock. Like the workday was 9 to 5 or 8 to 5, and like the five of us in the tire shop would have a coffee, and like you would look forward to that break and the lunch break, and it was just a very consistent way to like get together. And we talked about sports and like politics and the usual stuff. But was this different somehow? Like there feels like there's a more of a community element, and it was more like just expected this would just happen no matter what.
Yeah, I think your experience is a really good one, because that was something that happened a while ago, but that is kind of seen as a bit kind of old school approach to taking breaks. But I think we've lost a bit of that structure, right? So the idea that you can have these formal breaks. We know throughout 2020 that burnout across the world increased. And I think part of that is when we're not in the workplace, when we're all working, or lots of people are working remotely, we've lost a lot of that structure, and we just get carried away with work. And it's really difficult, I think, for us to take that moment to pause and step away from work. Yet we know, that our minds are finite. We can't work consistently for long periods of time. We need ideally about a 15-minute break for every hour that we work, according to science. And so I think some structure around those breaks is really, really good, and getting people to use those breaks to kind of build connections with each other, I think, is really important. Because I've had experiences in my life where I've found out where colleagues I work with have had childcare responsibilities, but also elder care responsibilities, which I wasn't aware of. And so all of a sudden I start to understand why it's important for that person to leave the office at 4 o'clock, because they need to pick the kids up from school and go and visit their relatives in care homes or wherever it might be. And I think the more we understand about our colleagues' lives, the better colleagues we can be. And I think that just creates a really nice environment. So I absolutely advocate for time away from work and time spent with the people that you work with to build those kind of important emotional connections, which is exactly what you would have experienced, by talking about the films you watched or what was on Netflix, your politics. You'll start to build some connections with people that you probably didn't know were there.
Do you like this? Kind of leads me to think about the 4-day work week and where that is going. And what you're saying is, in part, like we should be taking a 15-minute break every hour, which during COVID would be a radical departure from the back-to-back Zoom meetings that we're doing right now, which I do not feel is totally sustainable. If we're supposed to take intermittent breaks, do you think the 4-day work week is the way to go with that? Like, because that's been a really popular thrust in modern workplaces. Let's just work 4 days a week, take 3 days off, as maybe an antidote to that. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, when you and I first connected and spoke, that was 6 months into the pandemic, and I think, almost 6 months later, on the year anniversary, and especially our first lockdown, we've started to realise, exactly as you said, so much of this stuff which worked really well at the start is not sustainable. And we see today across Europe, Citibank have announced today that they're having days where no employee is allowed to set Zoom meetings. So there's a whole day of the week where they're saying, do you know what, no Zoom at all. At the start of the pandemic, Microsoft did a really interesting experiment where they just monitored how their employees worked and gave them kind of free rein over how they worked during the pandemic. And within the first 2 months, they found that they self-allocated Zoom-free Fridays because they realised that actually we can't be constantly on this performance that is kind of in front of a screen. And so I think what we've started to realise, and an awful lot of my book is about this idea of it feels like we're ready to shake up what the working day and the working week looks like. And one of the stories in the book is about a gentleman called Robert Owen, who was born in 1771, who set up some mills in a place called North Lanarkshire in England, in the UK. And he ran quite a number of these mills, and the way he thought about the way we treated people led to quite a lot of significant changes. So he started to realize things like, oh, actually, these people are working too long and their productivity doesn't get better as the day goes on, it gets worse. So actually, we're running people to the ground and we're not getting the best out of them. And so he decided to reduce the working day from 12 hours to 8 hours. Really radical at the time. The idea at the time was the more people work, the more we get out of them. And he started to realize that actually it's not, because that energy is finite. We can't continually push and push and push people, and the work productivity continues. And even looking at modern research, we can see that past about 40 hours a week, people's productivity sometimes gets so bad, it's just not as worth having them in the workplace, because the maths just don't make sense. And so in 1770s, 1780s, something like that, in the early turn of the 1800s, you had people who were starting to realize that actually this is not right. And Robert Owen instigated the 8-hour working day, and people told him on his deathbed that they felt like he'd wasted his life. Yet
No.
But Henry Ford saw what he did, came across to the UK, saw what he did, and went through his mills, and thought it was such a great idea that he went back to the US with that idea. And that is the reason why we have the 8-hour working day now, because that became kind of part of our institutions. And it just took one man to kind of look at, actually, I think there's a better way of doing this. And that was over 100 years ago we've had now. So with every other part of our lives dramatically changing and society evolving so much, why do we still think 8 hours a day, 5 days a week is the right way to get the best out of people?
Do you think it'll be the pandemic that shakes things up? Like that has, whether we like it or not. And I think that change is likely, some elements are permanent. And your hypothesis was that, like, this will be changed eventually. It's been 100 years. Let's look at things differently. And then the pandemic happened. So what elements of this are permanent? What elements of this will kind of go back to the old Ford model, in your estimation?
I think the most interesting thing about the pandemic and how it affected the world of work is that we got people to think differently about things. So people like myself have talked for years and years around the idea of we need to trust people just to get on with the job, that giving them the autonomy and trust is a really good way of getting the best out of people. And by allowing people to remote work and work flexibly, it's really good for their mental health, because they're able to build work in around their lives and their responsibilities outside of work. And so many organizations would tell me, yeah, it sounds great, but it would never work in my organization. I heard that time and time again. And more often than not, the reasons why it wouldn't work in their organization was nothing at all to do with the concept of flexible working. It was because they had a command and control leadership, or they just didn't trust their employees. Or when they said it wouldn't work in our organization, they had a vision of somebody in their organization in their head that they were thinking, oh, that guy Dave, he's going to abuse that if I let him do that. And so I'm responding to that by saying, well, that's not an issue with the concept of flexible working. You're employing somebody you don't trust. So why are you employing them? Why are they working with you if you don't trust them to do the right thing? And I could give you a list of maybe 20 companies who told me flexible and remote working wouldn't work for them. And here we are a year into the pandemic, and I'm able to go back to those businesses and say, so did it work? And every single one say, yeah, okay, it did. And so I think what it's done is given us this really big experiment in, oh shit, maybe we can trust people, and most people aren't going to let us down, and most people are going to continue to work and be productive. Because I just don't believe that anyone wants to go to work to do a bad job. I just think we all want to do a good job. We want that purpose. We want to feel belonged and recognised. And sure, you'll get a few people every now and then that will abuse that and not do work as much. But you're living under a cloud of illusion if you think all of your employees are currently, even before the pandemic, working every single hour of every single day and being really productive. It's just not true. So I think conceptually the pandemic just showed us there are different ways of us doing things, and we can be more experimental.
And do you have a model in mind? Like, do you have a best practice? Like, you've traveled the world with this. You've worked in employee wellness for many, many years. You've seen hundreds of models. What do you think would be the best way to structure this? Like, what would the most ideal, the most modern, the most efficient and effective workplace, what would that look like in terms of a structure?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think what the biggest things I found out when I did the research for my book, and a couple of years later, I still stick by this, is that so much of what we see as progressive in the workplace at the moment has its roots in cultures and societies that are hundreds of years old. I could give you some quotes that were written in the 1600s that you would think somebody like Steve Jobs had said a couple of years ago. And I think it just really shows us that what we've always wanted as humans and what we've really valued hasn't changed. Everything else around us has changed massively, but we still want purpose, we still want belonging, we still want to be connection with other people. And when you look at all the research psychologists have done about kind of happiness and what psychologists kind of refer to as subjective well-being, is this idea that these very core things, they're kind of back to the tribe and fire of what it's like to be a human. That stuff hasn't changed. And so the workplace that empowers people, gives them autonomy, trust them to get the job done, works out whether some of those people need direction, because some people like a framework and want an idea of support, and some people you can just get them into your organization and they'll kind of sort things out for you. I think there's loads of people that I know, and your listeners and yourself will all know people who are good at what they do, and if they are let loose in an organization, will solve problems because people want to do a good job. And I can even think back to when I worked in a shop throughout university. There were people stacking shelves with me who did a much better job at stacking shelves. It's something as simple as that. They cared more. They wanted to support customers. They realised that finding the items you want and having a nice display was a better experience. And so I think allowing people to kind of grow within your environment is really, really important. And a really good example I saw of this recently was a company I know had somebody working their marketing team who was kind of underperforming, and they were starting to make some decisions about, do we need to get rid of this person? They're not really suited for the role, and they also didn't really like the role. But this person had a YouTube channel for their baking, which had tens of thousands of regular viewers. And then they were telling me the story. I remember saying to them, why can't this girl do all of your videos, all of your corporate videos, all of your customer webinars? You've got somebody who knows how to capture the imagination of an audience, who knows how to grow a kind of an audience base. So you've got those skills. So although the role you're putting them in isn't perfect for them, there's probably another role that really works. And throughout my career, there's been loads of examples of, if you find what people are really good at and lean into that, you'll find some really talented people already working in your organizations. And I think that's a big kind of fluffy concept for a lot of people to get around. We employ people, give them money, we don't give them a job description, and we just let them get on with it and they'll find things to do. But there's plenty of companies that are really succeeding at that, and one of the big names who does that is Netflix. And they're kind of, that one of their people says that if we let somebody in our business for 2 weeks to just look around and speak to people, they'll come back to us and say, okay, this is what I think I can fix.
That sounds like a very modern and kind of new age concept, to not even give people a job description, just let them go. But the pressure would be on hiring, I think, in that context. Like, you have to hire a person who is inquisitive, a person who wants to drive toward that purpose and meaning. And is your thought that everyone has the want and ability to get into a workplace and solve problems? Because there are people who don't. There are people who want and crave, and that's a good thing, structure and very clear direction and very clear rubrics on how they go about their day, and that's a great thing. And I imagine that when we're talking about the Ford example, you have a 100,000, 200,000 person workforce. How many of those folks are going to be problem solvers, as opposed to how many want to show up, go to work, provide for their family, get home in the same shape that they came into? How does that play into this concept of go in and discover and learn and fix?
It's a really important point, and clearly there are. I had an old manager who used to refer to those people as plodders, and they kind of said that it's okay if these people just plod along because their purpose and their value comes from stuff that happens outside of work. They might have cultural, spiritual, or hobbies, different pursuits that they really kind of value, and that's where they get their purpose and belonging in life. And work becomes a way of enabling those things to happen. And so I think it's really important. That's why some people need some kind of a framework and might need direction. And clearly, you'll have factories with production lines where finding purpose and finding your place is really difficult when your job might just be putting things in boxes and having these really repetitive tasks. But I think organizations just need to get much better at finding out who those people are, accepting that if that's the life they want to live and that's the work experience they want, that's great. But if you don't spend more time to try and find out more about your people, you might miss those really talented people. And a really great example was on television years ago. One of the big the grocery chains in the UK is a company called Sainsbury's. And they did a documentary where they took the chief executive of Sainsbury's and they took him back to the shop floor. So they basically gave him a job in a grocery store, packing the shelves, cleaning up, all that kind of stuff. And he got talking to a member of staff who'd been working with them for about 2 years. And this guy had done a marketing degree, but was struggling to find a job. And he'd worked at Sainsbury's part-time before, and during his degree, and 2 years full-time afterwards. So he'd been at Sainsbury's for about 4 years, had a marketing degree, but couldn't find a marketing job. And the CEO was like, "We've got a marketing department. Why aren't you working with us?" And this guy was like, "Oh, I applied, but nobody responded." And he kind of said, "We have somebody here in our business who wants to be in marketing, who knows our customers, has worked with us for a long time, so knows our brand and our values and our customers and how the business is, and they want to do marketing and have that qualification. Isn't that the best kind of marketing person we should have?" And I don't think many organizations think that way. I don't think we know enough about the people that work with us to be able to say, "I think you might be really good for a different role," or "What do you want to do? Do you want to work in HR? Because if you want to work in HR, let's train you up and let's get you some experience. And it doesn't matter that you're working in a call center now. Let's see if we can get you to move into a different role." And for every one or two, three people that you do that with who might find out that role is not for them or it might fail, I think you'll get a lot more where actually that investment in people will really pay off in the long term.
So this makes a lot of sense. What's getting in the way? Is it how we're training leaders and managers? Is it our mindset around what a workplace should look like? Is it our focus on share price? Like in your estimation, what's getting in the way of this kind of next evolution of getting to this how it should be?
I mean, traditionally, I think, because I see that as designing the employee experience around the employee, so kind of putting their needs at the center and knowing that if you have a happy, content, purposeful employee, regardless of what that job is, you will get more out of them. Now, the tides are turning, and the pandemic has certainly changed, I think, who we see the stakeholders are in a business. So we used to always see kind of investors, customers as kind of primary stakeholders. And if you look at some of the research that's come out of the pandemic, you now have about a fourth of consumers who are saying, actually, the way you treat your people is a really important buying criteria. So whether you're B2B or B2C, you've got customers now who want to see how you treat your employees. And we saw this, especially in the US through the pandemic, where consumers were saying, if you're not paying sick pay, you're expecting somebody to go home and self-isolate. We think that's wrong. We think you should be paying them. It's not their fault. And so you had wide-scale consumers saying to employers, you've got to change these practices because I'm not going to buy from you unless I know you're doing right by people. And that has been a growing change in consumer behavior, but a significant change since the pandemic started. And at the end of 2020, globally, about a third of consumers say how you treat your employees is now the most important buying criteria. And they value that above having the item they want to buy from you in stock, which kind of blows my mind that people are really valuing that. And data from 600 of the US largest investors, 94% of them now say that they want to see how how an employer treats their employees before they will invest in them. And we've seen it in the news today in the UK. One of our big takeaway delivery services, Deliveroo, investors are basically saying, unless you start treating your workers like employees and giving them the holiday pay and the sick pay and stop treating them as gig workers, we're not going to invest in you anymore. And that's a huge shift. So consumers and investors are now saying, actually, we all now understand that the better you invest in your people, the higher the shareholder returns, the bigger the profits, the better the customer experience. So all these new stakeholders are now saying, actually, yeah, you've got to treat people well because that creates better outputs for kind of everyone involved.
So it's consumer driven and investor driven at this point, which is interesting, that it's taken that turn to not just the right thing to do, but yeah, which is I think a pretty common thing in capitalism, right? Where we make changes once the money demands that we make changes. So amazing to hear that consumer behavior is changing as a result.
I genuinely feel like, to a certain extent, we're seeing the erosion of capitalism a little bit in society. Yeah, the pandemic, we know, has completely exacerbated the inequality divide right across the world. The people who are knowledge workers on high salaries who could work from home have barely been affected materially or financially by the pandemic. Yet those low paid workers, especially women, young people, have had their jobs disappeared or their salaries disappear because they work in hospitality. In the UK, for example, 78% of people who were furloughed were women. So the gender equality that we've been fighting against for such a long time has now been widened again by the pandemic. And I've seen some research recently where they asked people kind of, how do you value work as part of your life? And you've got something like 65% of people under the age of 40 saying they no longer see doing a good day's work as a kind of value of who they are as a person. And they no longer see that if I put in work, that I will get the rewards that I need. And these are people that have grown up in an environment of a kind of, post 9/11, and kind of we've seen some, pretty serious wide scale terrorism that we've never really experienced before. They've been through two financial crises that have both disproportionately affected people under the age of 40. So right across the UK, the US, and most of Europe, you've got a cohort of people, a generation of people that have been kind of pretty royally screwed over in a number of different ways, who are now kind of growing up in a world where they're saying, I used to believe that if I worked hard, I would get the things I deserve in life, and I don't see that anymore. So if I am going to give somebody my 8 hours a day or my 5 days a week, whatever the time is, it's got to be for something else other than money, because money is no longer the attracting factor for most people.
Wow. Okay. So it's more like yeah, well, and that changes kind of our perception of purpose too, right? Like we're not just thinking about the workplace as our main driver of purpose. It is, and it's not even 50-50 at that point. It's like work doesn't get me what I need. So I need to find other things that get me what I need. Yeah, that sounds like it does have the power to shift capitalism to some extent, right? And I wonder how organizations are going to adapt to that. I wonder how organizations are going to, and maybe it's this very thing that we're talking about, right? Where companies are just putting so much more importance on flexibility and purpose as opposed to wage.
And I think, in the US and the UK, before the pandemic, we had kind of 40-year highs of employment rate. So it was a buyer's market for employees. Something like 86% of global CEOs said that hiring the talent they needed was difficult because those people already worked elsewhere. So that kind of war for talent was very much on before the pandemic hit. And whilst we will recover, it might take a few years because it's more difficult for businesses to hire people than it is to let them go. We will get back to that point in the next couple of years, and we will all be vying for talent again. So we've got a whole group of customers effectively looking at your business, looking at my business, and saying, okay, so if the salary is largely the same and the benefits are largely the same, why would I come and work for you when I could get the same salary elsewhere? And that's where they'll start looking at, oh, actually, you're a Ben and Jerry's or you're a Patagonia, and I like the way that you've stood up to Donald Trump and you supported immigration and you did all these things that are important to me as an individual. So I'll come and work with you for $5,000 less a year because you're actually helping me achieve some of the things I want to do in life and live the kind of life I want to lead. And I genuinely feel like that will happen quite significantly. Now, I completely get that that is a luxury to have that decision. And there are plenty of people in society who just have to work. They might be low skilled manual labor jobs where they just need to go to Walmart and work, and purpose is a luxury they can't afford because they're trying to keep food on the table. But for lots of those highly skilled, knowledgeable people, there is so much demand, and there will continue to be so much demand for them. They have the luxury of choice and will decide, actually, I'm not going to come and work for you when I could work for this business that I think is doing some social or environmental good.
Yeah, the thing about luxury around purpose is a really interesting one because I wonder if any of these concepts apply to uh, if you're working in South America or if you're in Africa or any particular country in Africa. Um, I'm thinking about some of the countries I've traveled to in sub-Saharan Africa where the economy is so much of the economy is still based on manual labor. And there's community and there's purpose in and around that, but the purpose of that job and going to a cool tech company where you believe in what they stand for, I don't know if that applies for so much of the world.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think for some of those developing countries, yeah, it's just it's not a luxury that's there because, you look at why are people still poaching? Why are people still kind of cutting forests down? For lots of people, the demand is there to do that work because they don't have that luxury over, I think I'm doing the wrong thing. They're just trying to control the world they exist in, which is, I need to feed my family. And I can't think about the environment. I can't think about recycling because I've got this big problem in front of me that I need to solve. And so I completely get that point that probably more of the world is in that situation when you kind of look at kind of how much money per capita has around the world, and employees in parts of South America, Africa, and China in particular just do not have that luxury. They're just trying to put food on the table. Um, but I think the people down the other end of the scale are the ones that can probably make the impact because they're the people that you're hiring into your business that will make some of these big decisions about where your direction is. They're the people that you'll hire into the board someday. And so hopefully they're the ones that can kind of drive the decisions on behalf of all of us to do the right thing for the world and our societies.
I another kind of set of burning questions I had for you since we last met, and this is kind of a shift in gear back to the productivity thing, is around the workplaces that continue to not change, and there's arguments to be made that they'll just always be the way that the old mills used to work, where you're just working people 12, 14, 16 hours a day. And there's still a mentality where we're just trying to squeeze that last ounce of productivity out. And if that person can't take it, then they'll leave. And I've been really dying to get your opinion on those workplaces. The ones that come to mind, that my experience in medicine is one of those. Legal firms, accounting firms. I had an intern who was in medicine who was an iBanker in a former life. She was an analyst, and the kind of like ho hum joke that they have as an analyst is if you don't show up on Saturday, don't bother showing up on Sunday. And you're just continually driven to work harder. And then there's this process of self selection. If you survive and you make it, then you'll, make a lot of money. I just wanted to know your opinion on those workplaces because I don't see those in particular changing because the carrot at the end is like this financial thing. And the culture is so ingrained in the history of those workplaces. I wonder if you've had experience or studied those or, in your travels, saw any of those workplaces that literally will not change.
So this is why I think the investor and consumer stuff is important because they will force those companies to change. It might take a long time and it might never happen, but you look at somebody like an Amazon as a great example. So there's not a week that goes by that I don't see some story about working conditions at Amazon. And this idea that the kind of people aren't allowed to take breaks and people are kind of at it for 7 hours straight and, they have to ask to go to the toilet and all this kind of stuff. And somebody shared on Twitter today, actually, this one of the stories about Amazon workers are urinating in bottles at their workstations because if they leave to go to the toilet, their productivity is going to fall and they won't get paid or whatever it might be. And I saw a tweet back to somebody's tweet from Amazon themselves, from Amazon Help, and it was basically them saying, Do you really think people are peeing in bottles rather than taking a break? If that was true, nobody would work here. Really disingenuous comment, in my opinion, because people have to work there. If you're working at Amazon and you're working 40 hours a week and you're working every Saturday and Sunday and all this type of stuff, you're doing that because you probably have no other choice. And you start to see how states like Alabama are trying to unionize workers in Amazon, and Amazon are really trying to stop that from happening. And people have shared posters where Amazon are kind of saying, "Don't unionize, we'll help you in other ways." And so there's really kind of worrying trend where Amazon are fighting against unionization, and people like Bernie Sanders have been really outspoken about people like Amazon. And I think the only way that will change is if we as consumers start to look at businesses like that and say, what kind of a world are we going to create if you carry on doing what you're going to do? And at what cost am I going to get my things delivered by Amazon Prime tomorrow or the same day and slightly cheaper? But at what cost? And actually, am I fueling a system that is exploiting people? Question mark. And so I think that's why that power of investors and consumers. And I saw a graph the other day about kind of, if you have a B Corp at the moment or a business that is kind of remotely sustainable or purpose driven, you are getting more attention and investment from investors. If you're an individual who's putting your money in ESG investing, environmental social governance, so you're investing in companies that do well, for 3 years now, those investments have outperformed some of the traditional investment routes that invested in things like buildings and arms and all that kind of stuff. And so I do think as a society we are changing what we value, and the pandemic has certainly made us realize that actually those low paid key workers, we really needed those people, so maybe they shouldn't be low paid, and maybe we should be shopping more local. And I think certainly in the UK, when you look at some of the trends, we are going to create towns that are going to reduce in size, and commuter villages and commuter towns are going to thrive, where people are starting to again realize, do I go to Starbucks for my coffee, or do I go to the coffee shop down the street? And actually that it must be a better choice because the money is staying here, and when it stays here, I see the investment in my local healthcare, my local education. I see the investment in my own kind of city, rather than it go to some shareholder in the US. And I think that's a really important change that lots of people are trying to make. And I think you only have to look at people's changing attitudes to the environment and recycling to know that we are starting to become more conscious as people than we ever have before. And where I live in Wales in the UK, we're now the third largest recycler in the world. Households in Wales now recycle more than most countries. And it's kind of great to see, but a huge, huge change in very short space of time. And I get, this all sounds very romantic, I get that, but there is a lot of data backing up that people are becoming more social about and socially conscious about our societies and our communities.
I'm trying to think about the two forces of like consumerism and do-gooderism, and like whatever that other side is, like making purpose-driven consumer choices. And I feel like this has been around for a long time. Like there was this whole thing about child labor in Nike. I think I have to fact check this, but Nike like making their shoes in like the global south, and like paying their 10-year-old workers cents for an hour of labor. And I can't tell you if that's changed. That seems to have gone away. I know there's a brand in Canada, Joe Fresh, and again, this needs to be fact checked before I get sued. There was this factory in Indonesia that like had really terrible working conditions. It literally imploded, killed a bunch of people. The brand survived. So I don't know. I tend to think that people like forget about these things, and this is a highly cynical view. I get that. But do you like the bottom line question? And I want a glimmer of hope here. Do you think people give a shit? Like, do you think people care more about how people are treated, the people that we can't see and we never interact with, in the invisible capitalistic structure that creates our cheap shoes and our, nice coffee? Do you think people care more about that, or do you think people care more about the the purpose behind it or treating people well? Like, what's your personal take on that? Because I think the market force often overpowers our purpose as consumers, and we're kind of blinded to it, right? Because we see the nice labels and the nice marketing efforts, and we eventually get some PR spin on what really happened with that factory in Indonesia, and then we kind of move on and we keep buying Joe Fresh. So I don't know what your opinion is on that.
I mean, we will start to see lots of it in the UK soon because obviously, as we've removed ourselves from the EU because of Brexit, there's been this big focus from lots of people, which is, we should be buying British. The money should be coming from our economy and it should be going back into our economy. Now, for that to happen, we have really good labour laws. We give people state annual leave. We give them maternity benefits, paternity benefits. We have sick pay. We've got a very good social system. We've got the NHS, our healthcare for all system. All of that costs money, which means average salaries and average wages are higher. So suddenly, if you want to buy a T-shirt that's made in Britain, you're probably going to pay $50 for that versus a T-shirt made in Taiwan or some part of Asia, which might cost you $5. And so I think, again, the luxury will be for those people who can afford it, they can afford to make more conscious choices. But if you're earning minimum wage, you can't spend $50 on a T-shirt when there's a $5 T-shirt that will achieve the same thing for you. And so I completely get that that's going to change. But, you look at lots of people, there's a great guy called Dan Price from Gravity Payments, who people can see on Twitter, who really kind of socially conscious CEO. And he talks a lot about actually every time we've increased the minimum wage in the US, it hasn't materially affected the cost of products. That money has to come from elsewhere. And I think if people really realized how much the shareholders took from the products and services we buy, they would probably be alarmed at kind of how much more you could probably pay people and how much more you could improve working conditions without affecting the cost. But again, I see it as a luxury. I'm not on minimum wage, so I completely understand that if I see a $5 T-shirt made in a sweatshop versus a $30 T-shirt made at kind of handmade locally to me or whatever, I'm able to make that choice because I've got that luxury of choice. And so I think there's this delicate balance around, exactly right, that we've got to be able to find ways to create affordable products for the people. And, part of that, if you look at some of the experiments that are happening in, parts of California and Finland, this idea of kind of universal basic income, which is, okay, let's raise the bar on what the least kind of, or the most deprived people in society have available to them in cash and see what the impact is. And actually, lots of experiments I've seen have showed that when you give people more money, they start to solve more problems with it and actually start to become more active members of society. But again, this is all really progressive, and people think this is kind of this fluffy, kind of hippie future where everyone's treated well. And, if I was to talk like this openly in the US, I'd be called a communist because people don't know the difference between communism and socialism. But America, as an example, has a social welfare system. You have people that take social care, so they already have socialism. So as much as people fought against that, socialism does exist in the US and does support a lot of people. But it feels like this is the new sprouts of a new way of thinking about things, and I think the people who have the luxury to make some of those choices will make those choices more ethically, and the more ethically they make them, the more people like supermarkets and the people who make these products will have to fall into line. And we saw this in the UK many years ago, where huge growing trend for not having battery farmed hens eggs in supermarkets, and it didn't go away. It was the front of every newspaper, all these squalid conditions that you were keeping chickens in kind of really small cages, and people decided that actually this is not right. And because of that mass adoption, and because so many supermarkets and grocers said, okay, we're stopping battery hens, we're not going to have battery hens, we will only stock free range, it became the default choice. And because it became the default choice, prices went down and it became more affordable to buy organic eggs than it did battery farming eggs. So we have examples of how that consumer behavior can slowly erode some of those bad practices.
I appreciate that. You've restored my hope in consumer behavior and society. And with that, I just wanted to ask you kind of what you're up to nowadays. Are you writing another book? Are you doing more research? Are you grinding away during the pandemic at your job? What are you up to now? And how can we get more of what you're talking about these days?
So the last 12 months has probably been the busiest of my professional career. All of a sudden, overnight, everyone realized that, oh, looking after employees, actually, we should be doing that. How do I do that when they're not sat in front of me? And so I've been helping kind of large brands kind of just figure out what that looks like and kind of working with them to kind of say, actually, how can we better support people, not just through the pandemic, but what's coming next? Because the next wave of this pandemic will be a mental health epidemic because we've locked people down and put them under so much pressure for a long time. And we know from other traumatic events like Hurricane Katrina, 9/11, the Chernobyl incident, the mental health runoff for big scale societal trauma lasts longer than the event itself. So preparing employers for the kind of supporting the mental health of their staff over the years to come. I did a record number of talks. I think I did 72 talks in 2020, which is double what I usually do. But remote things like this allowed me to kind of speak at conferences all over the world really easily. I am looking at the next book. The next book I think is going to be around financial well-being. So how can we better support employees to kind of make better decisions with their money? With all the research I've done around kind of employee well-being, money is something we really, really worry about and we stress about. And I would love to try and move people away from this false idea of what success looks like and how it's tied to money, and move people more to kind of not valuing the kind of stuff they see on Instagram and start to value kind of human connection. Because again, it's just peeling back 200 years of development and realizing that we haven't just evolved that much. If there's a really good example, I think, of how in our infancy we are in the world. There's a place called Cheddar in the UK, which is a series of cave systems that's become a tourist attraction. And there's a series of steps that run up through these caves, and they call it Jacob's Ladder. And there must be 200, 300 steps taking you up the side of a hill. And each part of the way, there's a sign telling you what period of kind of prehistoric history you're in. So the Triassic period, Jurassic period, etc. When you get to the top of this set of steps, it takes you probably 10, 15 minutes to walk up there. There's a sign telling you that if you get one sheet of A4 paper and lay it on the top step, that represents how long humans have been on the earth since the earth was created. And it blows your mind that we're in that. Kind of really shows you kind of how new we are to the world. And I think our society has developed at such a pace, we just haven't caught up with it. We are still fairly simple animals, I think. And the things we want and value in life and work haven't changed. And so with all this talking I'm doing and all the stuff I'm trying to help employers with, let's peel that back to that kind of purpose, belonging, connection, love, and all this kind of stuff that seems quite progressive and fluffy, but actually is pretty intrinsically what it's like to be human. And so whatever I can do to push those messages out and create workplaces designed around those kind of core things is kind of what I intend to do going forwards.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant. And I can't wait to see what you come up with next. I think the world needs more of your ideas. And yeah, we've been very fortunate to have you on the show today. So yeah, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. And when the new book comes in, we'll be hounding you to get back on here because we need to hear those ideas.
Excellent. Really appreciate the opportunity. Really good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I loved that conversation with Gethin. As you could tell, he's a big thinker. He's talking about capitalism and socialism and communism and how those concepts all meld together to develop our employee experience. We talked about consumerism and this evolution of investors and consumers caring about purpose-driven brands that treat their people well. And he believes very strongly that that will be the edge that organizations, large corporate brands, have in retaining employees and building a better brand. And, getting more market share is literally treating the people in your organization well. We talked a little bit about mental health, but it wasn't the primary, it wasn't the focal point of the conversation. We talked a little bit about how there will be a echo pandemic after all this, and we have some data to support that, unfortunate data. And, mostly we talked about how the employee experience is now being put front and center of organizations. It used to be the shareholders. It used to be the client or the customer, maybe even the C-suite. That was the focal point of the organization. But now there's a dramatic shift toward the employee being the focal point and all the excellent things that have come from that. I really enjoyed the conversation. It's free flowing, and those are my favorite conversations to have. And there was also a ton of knowledge and statistics and stories about where we're going with the workplace. So yeah, I hope to talk to Gethin again, and I wish him all the best because he's obviously done amazing things. Did over 70 talks last year on employee benefits and wellness. And I hope you can follow him and read his book, A World of Good. Really excellent read. Thank you, listeners, for joining us today on Beyond the Checkbox, where you learn how to integrate more mental wellness into your organization. Usually, we bring in frontline leaders, and today we were really blessed to have Gethin join us today to give us his experience. And I'm your host, Ryan Todd. Thank you for listening.